prematurely cynical. This kid was already cynical and he was like 4 years old. You know, most kids don't get cynical till they're teenagers. You know, and then often they don't get completely cynical, and usually they more or less grow out of it. But it had happened to him much earlier. So this Lampwick character, he's already decided that he knows everything, that everyone else's opinion is worth nothing, and that there's nothing in culture or society that holds any utility whatsoever for someone like him. Now you can imagine developing that way if you were raised in a family where people were generally lying to you, and that they randomly treated you or neglected you, and that you couldn't discern anything about them that was admirable or positive. You know, of course you'd assume that the whole structure is corrupt and that you had to take care of yourself and no one else. Well, not of course. Not everyone assumes that under those situations. I shouldn't say of course. But it's a logical set of conclusions. So, and of course it's proportionate to some degree to how much abuse you take. Although there are lots of stories of people who've been terribly abused as children who grew up to be, you know, kind, remarkable, responsible, thoughtful people who were absolutely opposed to abuse instead of propagating it. There's no direct causal pathway. Anyways, Lampwick is pretty happy to be on this coachway to Pleasure Island, which he's heard about. He said, well, it's all you can eat, it's all you can smoke, you don't have to do any work, and you can do anything you want. So you might say, well, it's too good to be true. Like the gingerbread house in the Hansel and Gretel story, right? The kids are lost, there's a gingerbread house. It's a house, which is something they need, and it's made out of cookies. It looks like it's a little bit too good to be true. And of course, in the house, there's the negative part of that, which is the old witch who wants to eat children. And that's a story about what happens to people if they're offered more than they should be offered. So, anyways, Lampwick is firing off, he has a little slingshot and he's firing off pebbles at the horses who are pulling the carriage, and that's just kind of the guy that he is. So he takes Pinocchio under his wing, and the cricket is down there in the dust. He's caught back up to the carriage, but he's having a rough time at this point. And this is also a story to some degree about the transition into adolescence. You know, because adolescence is a time people are still pretty impulsive and their view is quite short term, and they're more likely to pursue immediate pleasures and all of that, and that can get really out of hand. So anyways, they separate from the mainland and go on a boat, and so they're off to Pleasure Island, dark place. And the coachman opens the gates and lets the delinquents into Pleasure Island, and they basically have a riot. And this is Pleasure Island here. It's full of amusement park rides. And you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting about horror movies, I'm sure you've noticed this, is that they're often set at amusement parks. And clowns are often characters of horror. We'll leave the clowns aside for now, but the amusement park thing, that's pretty interesting. It's like, why in the world would an amusement park be a place of horror? And the first question might be, well, have you ever been to an amusement park? Because there is something about them that's really, they have a dark side, a clear dark side. And part of it is that people with nothing better to do are spending money stupidly, and they're being fleeced by the people who operate the amusement park. You know, and they have, let's say, a stereotypically dark reputation, and they're moving around all the time, which is also something that psychopaths do, and all they're doing is moving from community to community and taking the money from the rubes, fundamentally. And so the amusement park, well, if you walk through an amusement park with that sort of thing in mind, maybe that's also coloring your vision, of course, but it's something that you can see very immediately. So there's something about them that's sort of deeply sad, but there's also there's an underlying horror that characterizes them, that it's easy for horror movie or horror novel writers to immediately expand upon, and there's something about it that makes sense to people. So it's too easy, maybe that's, and it's also all short-term gratification. That's the other thing. So you spend your money very rapidly and it's gone. Yep?
Well, it seems like a sort of a celebration of meanings divorced of actual reality.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's the impulsive element. The comment was it's a celebration of meanings divorced from reality. Yeah, it's also outside of reality, right? That's why it's on an island. It's a separate universe. And it's a universe where nothing that's happening is connected to anything outside. And you're spending your hard-earned money, let's say, but it isn't that much, it's certainly not an investment. It's not that much different than burning it. Well, it is, because of course you get some pleasure out of it, but it isn't, going there every day is probably not the wisest move that you could make. So, the animators do a good job of presenting the, what would you call it, the enforced hedonism, I guess I would say, of a place like that. This is a place where you're going to have fun. That's what it's for. So, anyways, Lampwick, who's got this very arrogant look on his face and this kind of strut, it's a bravado, that's what that's called. It's a false confidence, and it's the sort of thing that people do when they're trying to impress upon others that they're high in the dominance hierarchy, but really they're not. So it's a mimicry of dominance, but it's something that can be intimidating, there's no doubt about it. I had a friend, he didn't come to a good end, this person. He was a real good friend of mine when I was in junior high and high school, and he was kind of crazy. And he was tall, he was about 6'7", and he was pretty thin. And we used to go out to the bar now and then, and in many of the bars that we lived in this little town, there were bullies. And these were guys, and I worked in the bars, and I used to watch these guys, and they'd basically, there was a handful of them in town, pretty psychopathic types. And they'd go to the bar, and all they'd do is sit there and wait for someone to come in who they could beat up. And they knew who it was as soon as they walked in. That's actually why they were at the bar. And so they'd wait till someone came in who didn't look very confident and who could likely be intimidated by this sort of thing, and then they'd tell them to come outside for a fight, and if they didn't, well, then they'd of course make fun of them, and if they did, well, generally they'd beat them up. My friend kind of caught on to this trick, and he started going to bars, and every time that someone like that came near him, he'd go outside and fight with them. And one of the things he observed right away is that almost inevitably when he went outside with them, they'd shake hands and make friends. So as soon as and it was really remarkable watching him, because he wasn't a particularly physically powerful person, although he was extraordinarily tall. But he had started to play this game, and he did it for a long time. And I don't remember him ever actually having to fight. He just stared them down fundamentally. So it was a very interesting thing to watch. But it was an indication to me of exactly how shallow this kind of bravado bullying actually is. But people don't find that out because they won't stand up. And it's not surprising, but anyways, they load up on food. Pinocchio's carrying a pie and an ice cream cone simultaneously, and then they're off to have a fight. And Lampwick says something like, it's good to punch someone in the nose sometimes, just for the, I think he says, heck of it. And so Pinocchio adopts this strut, and in they go to the rough house. And then in the next scene, you see this model home up for destruction. It's quite an interesting scene symbolically. You see, in the middle of this house here, there's a stained glass window that has a mandala on it. We'll see it more clearly in a minute. And a mandala is a sacred symbol of the self. That's the Jungian interpretation. It's a symbol. It's very difficult to describe, but it's a symbol. Music is a mandala, except it's played out across time. So you could say that thing is the same as music, but it's kind of like a slice of music. It's the same idea. You know, sometimes you see those slow motion or sped up motion videos of a flower unfolding. That's the same, it's the same idea. You can imagine that being set to music, and somehow that would make sense. And the mandala is like a symbol of the unfolding of being, or the source of meaning, or something like that. And it's also a symbol of the self from the Jungian perspective. And so there you see it more clearly. The kids are starting to burn this place and to trash it, and they're dragging a grand piano down the stairs. The destruction of high culture, about which they're nothing but cynical, because they don't believe that hard work and sacrifice can produce something of any value, and they want to bring it down and destroy it. And that's partly because You can see this in the story of Cain and Abel. Abel is hardworking and everyone likes him and he makes the proper sacrifices, and so his life goes really well. And that's part of the reason that Cain hates him. And he's jealous and resentful. But worse than that, if you're around someone, if you're not doing very well, especially if that's your own fault, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad. And that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal because there were lions and you had a slingshot. And so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. So you weren't exactly this like 19th century English guy dressed in a, frilly blue suit. You were tough as a bloody, well, as someone who would go after a lion with a slingshot. It's no joke. Anyways, the statue is very heroic. And you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
Sure.
Status as a result
Success even.
Success as a result of hard work. But in the example of Cain and Abel, like one was a shepherd and the other was a farmer, and the one who
one is, yes, that's right.
and the one who was a shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question. The stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the whole entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala, and that's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. They basically say to hell with it and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So anyways, the coachman is paying attention to all this, and he's actually pretty happy about the fact that these boys are so involved in their stupid amusements that